This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here with Christian Madsbjerg, who is a professor at the New School in New York, also the author of a couple of books, actually very extensive writing in a variety of publications and channels. But you have two books. One is called A Moment of Clarity, using is it the human sciences? I don't have the book in front of me, to solve your toughest business problems. And then more recently, this book, Sensemaking, the Power of the Humanities in the Age of Algorithm. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Well, I think that when we read this book, Sensemaking, it's kind of a critique. It's a critique both of the subject and the methods that most people employ, both in academia and in business, to understand the world. In terms of the content, I think you argue that people focus too much on what we might call kind of the thin data and ignore the thick data. And I think that's kind of borrowed from Clifford Geertz's, right?
Correct.
Thick description, right? And then also, in terms of the so in terms of the methods, you argue that people are um, they're emphasizing too much the analytical and ignoring the insights that can come from what some people might call the intuitive, or the abductive, to use Charles Peirce's word. Um, is that a correct description? I mean, are you kind of going after, are those inseparable? I mean, is it necessarily the case that those who use the methods of analytics are necessarily going to be concerned with the kind of shallow data, or are these kind of separate problems?
Um, I think practically they're often connected. Um, but of course, I mean, I suppose intellectually you can definitely separate them. I think the I've spent 20 years dealing with very large companies, so I'm sort of been marinating in a kind of thinking that's maybe not always that's often fast. Let's call it that. And maybe not always totally thorough. So my sort of 20 years experience of seeing it happen uh, could be said that makes my analysis too unfair um,
Mhm.
intellectually. But having seen how big deal decisions are made based on one narrow set of uh, data and analytical capacity made me sort of write the book, and seeing it get a little worse and getting more arrogant in a way uh, uh, was sort of the original reason for the last book, and in many ways my interests. And you're right. I mean, thick data or thick description is directly lifted out of Clifford Geertz. And is inspired by that tradition in many ways, but is applicable now to the treatment of statistical data sets, let's say big data sets, um, and sort of the hype around it, and particularly the hype that was there 5, 6, 7 years ago when I
Yeah.
originally wrote the book, where it was very fashionable. It turned out to be less fashionable now, but at that point in time, it was very fashionable.
Well, you talk about pendulum swings, and I certainly have been participating in this kind of pendulum swing. I mean, I've studied humanities and social sciences, and a bit of the natural sciences. And I remember I think it was right 2010, when we at the business school completely revamped our kind of statistics core, and kind of made it more central, and uh, started launching classes in data science and so forth. And I like to argue that really this was motivated by kind of an underlying shift in the comparative advantage, right? So the cost of certain types of data acquisition dramatically declined, and so it kind of opened up, right? Kind of really big benefits that could be achieved from digging deeper into this. And so of course it was wrapped in all sorts of rhetoric, the Moneyball rhetoric, that you have all these old, idiotic people who are making intuitive decisions based on their experience, and we're just going to kind of sweep them aside and replace them with, this new way of doing things. And so it was a bit oversold. But to what extent is just a simply, we have this technological shift, right, where data sets are now available and computation is cheaper. So why wouldn't we want to just kind of shift more of the emphasis in that direction, at least until, we it runs out of steam and, we've used up all the advantages. And then all of a sudden now we can see that, all right, now that we've kind of used that up, we need to start thinking about, where the benefits are on the other side. Is it more of or is there more of like an ideological or, some kind of deeper problem than just simply, let's just shift back and forth depending on where the insight can be achieved?
Right. I mean, there's certainly a level of hyperbole around computer science that can be intolerable
Hmm.
sometimes. And I think over doesn't have an eye for some of the things about humans that are interesting and special, and that there are tools to analyze, and that I've seen be incredibly helpful, particularly when you're unsure um, about what on earth is going on, and what is important to people, and particularly when your starting point is let's call it fussy, uh, and things have changed. So I just saw the arrogance and the pendulum swing being so um, uh, uh, out of control. It's since corrected, sort of, but it came from access to more data. Uh, it came from an ideology of quantitative analysis alone, full stop, rather than, you could say, other tool sets. And I saw it pervasive, like everywhere in the world, really. So it was sort of a reaction saying, I think there are other things. There are other ways of analyzing humans, and there's certainly things you're missing about us, about what's important to us, about how we find our way around the world, that enormous data sets um, didn't solve, in a way. And even, when you get close to the people that are the best, let's say, at that kind of analysis, they agree. It was just more the generalized glaze of arrogance and misunderstanding that I try to correct. And then the other side of the question was, of course, that the humanities were bleeding, and still are, significantly. And I think that we lose a muscle, and we lose a whole lot of analytical capacity in terms of what we make, how we make it, what's reasonable to make, what's important and helpful, if we've lost our historians and our philosophers and our sort of people that understand stories and literature and music and so on. um, and that's too bad. And it's not just too bad for all of us, which it is. It's also bad for decision making. um, so it was a mix of sort of seeing the hyperbole on one side, and seeing the loss on the
Hmm.
on the side of, I call it human science, because there are parts of what's called the social sciences in America that I definitely want to include. Um, Not all of it. There's parts of economics that's maybe not included, but there's certainly big parts of the social sciences that I think are also about humans. So anybody that's interested in humans and us and our societies, and what's meaningful to us. So that was the original idea. It was an unease with the general state of affairs um, that have changed, but certainly was there at that point. Um, and I think the response to that was um, good, and particularly in Asia, for some reason, Japan, South Korea, people were concerned with the same things. They just couldn't put their put words to it, and they couldn't put their finger on precisely what it was that they also felt kind of an unease and a lack in their analysis.
Well, I think you sometimes refer to this as kind of the Silicon Valley mindset, right? So, there are people that all aspire to be like Silicon Valley, and there's others that are, recognizing some of the pathologies maybe of the Silicon Valley mindset. But in terms of the pushback, I mean, it seems like the pushback in part is coming from the realization that this type of analytics is something that can be done best by computers themselves, and that there's a comparative advantage for humans in terms of what humans are capable of understanding, and so we're essentially automating so much of what used to be done by folks like data scientists that this really leaves the humans to do the things that might involve empathy or and creativity or understanding humans, for instance, right? Which the computers might have difficulty doing. But you emphasize that this Silicon Valley mindset is also flowing back into the educational system, and there seems to be this emphasis on STEM, and educational resources are being plowed into STEM. We just here at Berkeley created this new data science school, which is costing us, a couple $100 million that we got donated to the school. But the humanities are kind of withering on the vine and aren't getting kind of these resources. Um, and so you're teaching something called applied humanities. Is this, I'd love to know exactly what that is, but do the humanities have to justify themselves by demonstrating their usefulness to corporations, when they're trying to sell merchandise? I mean, is that really what humanities have come down to, right? To show, hey, we too can help you make some money. We too can help you profit, right? You mentioned that, maybe the path to CEO is paved with an English major and a history major and not a computer science major. Do we, is that what we have to do? Is we have to demonstrate that humanities can have this utility in the modern business world?
No, I mean, there's sort of several sides that theoretically, no, right? Theoretically, history should be studied because we got to study history. Um, Comparative literature should be studied because it's important and exciting and so on. But there's also a practical argument. And I think what I found was that when big decisions are made in large corporations about things that touch our lives, there is an empty seat. Uh, so it's necessary to understand finance. It's necessary to understand the application of resources and doing that in an analytical way. It's necessary to understand technology, not just very advanced, but just what's possible, what can you make. But there's also a seat, I think, for people with a different sensitivity and a different kind of analytical, and I think it's analytical um, perspective. Um, and that is the case in, just a couple of examples. Our new mobility systems, like how do we move around in the world? Um, there was at the time a lot of, again, hyperbole from Silicon Valley that, what is now 3 years ago, we would not drive our cars anymore. And we would have 1 million robo taxis in North America, and nobody would own vehicles anymore. That was sort of that was the story. And I think even the people that are most advanced in that area and told it the loudest would agree that that didn't happen in 2018. Um, and it's not happened yet. Um, so, so, so there is this sort of possibility of the humanities having influence in something like our mobility systems or in our uh, the way relationships between us are mediated. So social media being one. I think something like the way we find love and the way courtship works has changed significantly the last, 5, 10 years, from when I grew up, where it was complicated, to now where it's probably complicated but mechanized in a different way. And I think love and courtship is a topic that we've been thinking about for a while, and that includes Aristotle and Romeo and Juliet, and there's a thousands of years of thinking about what on earth that is, and I think there's a role for people from the humanities, from the human sciences, to be part of that, not alone, but with computer science and with finance and with other technology. So the way we move around in the world, the way we communicate and engage each other, the way love and courtship works, seem to me to be topics um, where people from, let's say, a different, they come with a different epistemology, they come with a different approach to humans, seems relevant, and I've seen very helpful. And I think, left alone, technology and finance, which is the main drivers of most decisions, not in politics anymore, but in the business world, say, um, left alone, sometimes mistakes are made, and and sometimes it's not inspired enough. So it's not just stopping things and sort of the discussion of ethics and what's wrong about Silicon Valley. It's also imagination and expanding the horizon of what's possible with technology. Um, so that's what I mean by applied humanities. It's not in any way saying that humanities should be um, profit optimizing, um, uh, mechanistic, utility focused. I'm just saying that it should play a role. And right now, nobody reads the papers that come out from most social. I heard one day that the average anthropology paper is read by zero point 0.8 people. That's not enough.
That
Um,
presumably doesn't include the referees.
or the parents or the parents of the people writing them, and that's not enough. Um,
Uh,
and I think the best students are uh, that could be studying, say, history, are told either by
mm,
their parents that have to pay, or by their own risk-averse sort of nature, that's a hard bet to make, because how do you make a living afterwards? So I think the best students, or the people with the most heart, in those topics, are not mm, doing it anymore. That's too bad for them, because it would be interesting and exciting and important for them, but also for us in general, that we need um, the people that want it the most and that are most engaged in those topics to come to the universities and come to the education system with that enthusiasm, and being able to release that enthusiasm on the world. So I think that's my general opinion. By the way, I'm not against technology. I'm excited about it. I'm interested in it. I find it fascinating, and most of the things I'm doing right now is trying to figure out what is going on in the most advanced technological
mhm.
side of things, from a philosophical perspective. But so I'm not against it at all. I just found at that point there was such a dumb discussion about it, um, and not if you went to the best conferences and the best places, but if you went to sort of half mediocre discussions about it, it was just it just gave me a headache. Um, so it's this thing about finding it unfortunate that we don't use it enough. And by use, I mean use. I mean functionally using it and making decisions and coming up with ideas and so on. But also sort of a sadness about the deterioration of the field, that, if you think about it for 2 seconds, of course, is important in any society that we that we study those things and have strong institutions that study us and our worlds from something other than just a mechanistic kind of a perspective.
I think you quote some politician or business person who said, if you study English, you're going to work in Starbucks. I forget who that was. Notorious comment. But when you describe what you're doing with companies at Red Associates, when you help to understand kind of the customer, right? Understand the habitus, right, of the customer, maybe of the employee, of the world in which this company is operating, right? So it seems like the tools that you're using are ones that most people would describe as kind of social scientific tools to some degree, whether it's, anthropology or, sociology, right? Understanding where people get their meaning from, right? What is the, the symbolism and the mesh of meaning that they create and live in. And, then you mentioned things like, oh, it's too bad that Shakespeare and Beethoven are things for just to enjoy on the weekends. But it seems like if you're trying to understand the typical customer of a car or an app or whatever, Shakespeare and Beethoven aren't going to be what you ought to be studying, right? Shouldn't you be studying Justin Bieber and 50 Shades of Grey, right? I mean, shouldn't you be studying that stuff? I mean, isn't that where isn't that the habitus of the typical customer, right? I mean, what's the relevance of Shakespeare for understanding, somebody who's playing Angry Birds or buying a Lincoln Continental?
Right. And nothing wrong with Angry Birds or the Continental, but I think what I'm saying is there's a skill set that comes out of studying um, the 1880s and what happened with industrialization at that point, or studying uh, what it was like to live in um, 17th century Germany, let's say, or South Korea. There's a skill set of putting together um, different data sets that you sort of find from scraps in a way. You find it from what did they say, what did they listen to, what did they read, what was an everyday experience like from then. So, an example would be living during 1917 in England. What was it like to be an 18-year-old, being drafted at that point? It, that skill set is the skill set of a historian, right? Or an art historian would be able to study the Bauhaus and what happened at that time. And they can put together, sets of data, let's call it that for now, sets of information, and piece together what something might be like, um, or what it might be like to be uh, a person at that point or a group of people at that point. That skill set is trained in class and during university, and and the same skill set can be applied when you try to figure out um, what it's like to um, be an 18-year-old that is trying to figure out how to find love after being locked up for 2 years. Um, the same analytical attitude and the same sort of ability to piece things together that is nonlinear in a way. The data is not the same. You can't add it up in a spreadsheet or in a sort of a computer model. You have to analyze it, put it together, analyze it sort of in a hermeneutic way. So it's true that Beethoven doesn't have maybe not any direct relationship to, uh, uh, um, kids and toys today, but the technique you learn from studying it, if you study music history, for me, is so practical and so natural. Um, I just have to convince the world that that's the case, and sometimes it works. But I found people trained in those topics to be, once they see the application of it, the ability to analyze what's going on now, it turns out to be really helpful. So that's sort of the idea. The second thing is, you said it comes from the social sciences, and some of it does. I sort of ended backwards into the techniques of ethnography because it wasn't something I studied in school very much. Uh, it was, some people have said that RED is a group of philosophers doing anthropology. Um, and I'm not snobbish with, let's say, academic silos. I think we can all use those techniques. And um, I think um, there's a particular perspective, philosophical perspective on what humans are and human societies are that come out of a group of humanities and social science background, um, backgrounds that are all helpful. And I don't really care which one, frankly.
Yeah.
I've seen people that studied art history being incredibly skilled at understanding what it's like to be others, even though if you look at it from the outside, what on earth does, impressionism have to do with what's going on now? Well, it turns out the technique of studying it is of help.
So I think within each of these disciplines, there may be some people that are learning this practical skill of perspective taking, um, doing deep dives into the web of meaning, and there are others that aren't. Do you see the way in which we kind of teach humanities and social sciences now to be well designed for the development of that skill, or are we, have we moved far away from that intent, if that ever was the intent of how we would train people in these skills? And I guess the secondary question is, in the graduate programs, we tend to train people for academics and nothing else. And so the majority of folks who get PhDs don't wind up in academia, but the way in which they've learned their discipline is not easy to redeploy into the non-academic environment. So do we need to rethink how we're teaching the humanities in particular, and perhaps the social sciences, both at the undergrad and the grad level, so that people can, on the one hand, be better at this skill of interpretation of meaning and um, perspective taking, and then also, to be perhaps more, you know, uh, capable of applying these skills in environments outside of, getting those academic publications that have those zero point 0.8 readers.
Right. Well, I think there's a snobbishness, an unnecessary snobbishness in many of these departments that we're talking about, and it's very defensive. It's sort of um, painting itself into a corner in terms of engaging in the world, and not all of it. I mean, there's so much good stuff happening, but in general, I think it would be good if humanities and social science departments were a little less tribal. Um, and I have to say, I've moved around in the academic world, lecturing and teaching for a long time, and it seems to be getting worse. The tribalism seems to be getting worse. It's interesting that anthropologists just hate sociologists, and sociologists just can't stand historians, and they speak in their own language to themselves at their same conferences. And if you are not pure, let's say, in that particular tradition or that particular sub tradition, um, where five people tend to talk to each other about something, it's it's looked down upon. And I think we often take very smart, creative students and we educate them out of the possibility of using what they learn, and they end up
Is that
not using what
do you
they
think
learn.
that's do you think it's snobbishness, or do you think it's kinda insecurity, right? Like, in other words, you know, they're not sure about how valuable what it is that they're doing is, and so they have to kinda fall back on, these internal internally referential, criteria for success.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly insecurity, and it's also being feeling left out, I think. But it comes out as that, as many other things, but often as sort of a sense of fury and rage over the state of affairs. And um, that's not always fun to engage with. So let's say a PhD student have been educated in that for 10 years, and they come out and they are want to be in the public sector and engage with, healthcare matters or education or something like that, and their fundamental attitude is one of aggression and sort of so being a downer in a way. That's not great, and I think it's not. The misery is palpable, I think, in those departments, and that's too bad because it's not fun, it's not helpful, and everybody's angry, nobody's happy, uh, and that's generalizing unreasonably, but I just think we should be part of it rather than outside of it. Um,
Well, in business schools, I always think of business schools as kind of the clearinghouse for all sorts of disciplines that might be useful in pragmatic affairs, right? So, you know, the achievement of practical wisdom, right? You need all these different insights. But business schools are dominated by economists and, to a lesser extent, psychologists. And there's a couple anthropologists. I have a colleague who's an anthropologist, and a sociologist, right, teaching. But generally, it's economists and to a lesser extent, psychologists. And then throw in a couple engineers right into the mix, maybe some operations research people. And so, in a way, business school is not really doing the job of kind of teaching people the complete tool set that they need for an ACES in the modern world. Um, but there have been a couple attempts, and you talk about design thinking, right? So design thinking is I think in many ways kind of a pushback. I remember I was teaching something called human factors in engineering school, which kind of made its way into design thinking. And I'm here at Berkeley. I have a colleague who's an engineer who's teaching the design thinking class, while I, an historian, was teaching the you know statistics class, and we used to joke about it all the time. But design thinking is has makes reference all the time to anthropology, and a lot of times they claim to be anthropologists, and when they're doing customer journey mapping and observation, and the IDEO folks sit around and watch the kids brush their teeth and figure out like what they're doing, both in terms of how they use their hands, but also presumably what they're thinking. Um, Now, and you've been critical of this movement, but isn't your criticism sort of an affectionate criticism in the way that you have greater aspirations for what they're trying to do, and you think that you only wish they could do it a little bit better?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm criticizing the actual practice happening that I've seen for 20 years. And I think you're right. The source of it was Stanford University and human factors, engineering people, eh, eh, l- more so than design, in the sense of aesthetic and design vision and so on. That was added, and I think it is called ethnographic. Um, but when you see it, actually see it in a company that makes medical technical equipment somewhere, it's not impressive. It's very fast. It's sort of interviewing people for an hour and looking at them brushing teeth and then calling it a day. And I think that's under that's not enough. Um, and in a way, it has blocked, I think, maybe a more sophisticated analysis because you just get a little bit of design thinking. Often done,
So it's seen as kind of an add-on or a little, cherry on the cake. It's not seen as being an integral part of uh, of 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 business, right? It's in fact, I mean, we had it as sort of a one credit add-on to our core curriculum, and it's kind of faded a little bit.
yeah,
But I think you're arguing that the insight needs to be integrated much more deeply into kind of
yeah.
every aspect of what we do in business schools.
Yeah, I definitely. I think, I mean, first of all, we need people that understand, that are financially literate and that can be organized in terms of how you invest, how capital markets work, and so on. So, business schools necessary, helpful, and I know that not every business school are as proud of themselves as they were maybe in the 90s, but still, without MBAs, I don't know how on earth we're going to run anything.
Mhm.
Um, so that is sort of the beginning of it. But I think design thinking sort of covered up the necessity of understanding human worlds, and sometimes it's a sort of a superficial uh, choice. Sometimes it's kind of deep. Actually, there's some companies where I've seen it integrate in everything, it being integrated in everything, but it ends up being just a workshop that's fun and colorful for a while, and more like an HR exercise of people, you know, getting people together than than significant sort of analysis of what's going on. So that's too bad. Um, I have to say, and people laugh at me when I say this, I also miss aesthetic vision. Sometimes i- the places where design thinking is most prevalent, and that includes consulting or advisory firms, everything ends up looking the same. It's sort of nice and cute and have rounded corners, and have no risk involved. So some of these, some of this design thinking kind of practices have ended up where medical devices look like phones, look like TV sets, and look like, the interior of cars, without sort of thinking maybe people are different, uh, and maybe these human settings call for a different sort of aesthetic vision, design thinking sort of killed that. Uh, that's too bad because we need that too.
And I think you mentioned that oftentimes they start from a certain set of assumptions about people, like that they all want, you know, less frictions in their world, and that the whole purpose of design thinking is to kind of remove the frictions from the customer journey, which may not be true,
Exactly.
right, about people.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was from the 80s and onwards, there was a focus on convenience. And I think it's gotten a little worse actually the last 5 years, particularly because technology companies have been attacked so much that they're careful of taking any risks. So now it's just not just convenient, it's cute. And sort of the designs that are being made are all sort of nice and almost childish. And I don't think everything should be childish. I don't think everything should look that way or have the fundamental assumption that everything needs to be easy, frictionless, and cute. Um, that's not, at least my experience looking at people, that's not what I've seen being necessary and needed. Um,
Now, when you describe kind of acquiring this tool set of empathic capacity or anthropological capacity, you mentioned different frameworks, right? So, I mean, you mentioned Saussure, right? I mean, not an anthropologist, right? But you mentioned, Irving Goffman, also, not a anthropologist. You mentioned Marshall Salins. You mentioned these different frameworks, and I enjoyed that a lot because this is how I see economics done well, right? You have a bunch of frameworks, and I think it was Keynes said that economics is the science of model design and the art of model selection, right? So there's an element of uh, kind of metacognition. So you go out and you acquire these different frameworks, you acquire these different perspectives and on how to approach this anthropological endeavor. But then you need some kind of integrative function, right? You need to know kind of when do you apply which framework and in which context, and I think that's something that probably needs to be acquired through experience, right? And is something that's kind of difficult to do in a kind of theoretical setting. Is that right? I mean, how does this art of framework selection kind of play out in a practitioner?
Right. I think there's a core, and maybe that's because I am interested in phenomenology. Um, there, there's a there's a core analytical root, let's say a root to, or the trunk of the tree, is the analysis of human worlds. So how the world of theater or the world of um, uh, hospitals or the world of being a cancer patient. Those are all human worlds that have a structure to them. And that structure involves the manipulation of equipment. It has moods that you can analyze. It has a series of um, seemingly disparate kind of objects and equipment involved that hang together in a particular way. So let's take the world of theater. It's got um, actors, plays, tickets, chairs, stages. It's got Broadway. It has different categories to it. Some are very music centric, some are not, but they all have are part of a human world that has a particular structure. And I think that's where it starts for me every time, describing the human world and how that coordinates activity and is the root of meaning in that particular world. So any world I've ever seen is like that. And sometimes those worlds are merging. So one of the things I've had the privilege of studying for 15 years is the changes in the mobile phone from when it was a flip phone without a camera to a flip phone with a camera to a breakthrough into smartphones and so on. The world of smartphones then changed over time, and added new pieces of equipment and new pieces of sort of new parts of that world. So worlds can change over time as technology gets accepted and so on, but they're all worlds. So that's where it starts. And then once you have that, when you try to understand a world, you can then almost unreasonably sort of throw theory at it, and see how can we make a big amount of observation, and it has to be large because if it's based on an hour with 10 people, then it's difficult. But if it's large enough, then when does it snap into place? Um, and for me, I am kind of, it's kind of, people have called it like almost like dirty way of trying to analyze, throw things at it so that you can see how can we get this to become a meaningful whole, that we can test. And that's the abductive process, right? That's the process of trying to find a framework that you can then test. Then you can use statistics and computer science and all kinds of testing mechanisms. But the early stages of trying to make sense of a world has a world structure, has equipment, meaning, people in it, has a particular language, specialized language. It's got moods, so particular mood around it. And when that snaps into place, you can sort of see it clearly and you can then come up with ideas from it. You can test it. You can do lots of things with it. So that's sort of the approach I've had, which some people find uh, not siloed enough. Let's say it that way.
Well, it's
Because
also hard to it's hard to teach, right? So, abduction is it's easy to teach deduction. It's easy to teach induction. How do you teach abduction, right? I'm always puzzled by this, and I guess, the case method is one way, right? And I think experiencing different texts and different worlds, right, is a way. But, this moment of grace or clicking as you describe it, right? It's hard to engineer that. You talk about George Soros, right? And I love talking about him. I remember he came to Wharton right after he kind of crushed the Bank of England and described what he did. And I remember he came to University of Virginia and talked about his work with Popper and so forth. And I remember him saying, and you repeat the story in the book, he said, well, sometimes I know when to exit a position because my back hurts. Okay, well, all right, how are we gonna, you know, even if it turns out to have, credible predictive value, right? How do we teach someone to train their back so that, their back will hurt when it's time to exit a position, right? It doesn't seem scalable. It doesn't seem like something that we can, bake into the educational process, this process of, achieving grace or intuition. And I think also you use other examples in the book. One example uses like a firefighter and how a firefighter kind of knows, when to leave a building. And I've heard stories of this sort of thing. That doesn't seem rooted in the humanities at all, right? I mean, that no amount of Beethoven is going to help you figure out when it's time to leave a flaming building, right? It is sort of an intuition, but it's an intuition based on your understanding of the physical world and not the kind of human world. But I think, you're arguing that the human world is kind of more suited to induction as a method of knowledge and understanding than the physical world. Sure, there's going to be the Einstein has this pop of genius, but it's really the human world that is much more difficult to systematically and rigorously model, and
Yeah.
therefore it opens up more of an opportunity for this kind of insight.
Yeah, I mean, you make me think that the example about firefighters is a bad one, and I think you're right, um, because it's so physical in a way, and but it's based on seeing signs, right? It's based
Mhm.
on observation, and I mean, the next book I'm writing is called How to Pay Attention, and
But you
it's
can't well, you can't read a textbook and learn how to
no,
do what that firefighter does, right? I mean, I
exactly,
think that's the point, right?
it is.
You kinda have to be fighting fires for a while before this happens.
Right, exactly. The way I've done it, the way I've taught it for a long time is through um, having students like, or groups of students. I think doing it alone is very difficult. Um, some people can, but in general, it's hard. And have them pick a phenomenon, have them pick a something that they are a theme, let's say, that they're interested in. So an example could be finding love through dating sites, dating apps. And
Do you tell your
people,
students to go find love? Is this an
yeah,
assignment? You gotta find love, by the end of the semester, you gotta
no, no,
find
no.
love on a dating app.
Well, some of them actually do, which is fantastic. But no, figuring out people that use them and get an understanding of their world and how this piece of equipment is used in this world. And I mean, several of my classes, there have been groups that studied that. And one of the things they found was how mechanistic it is for people. So, how people that are heavy users of um, this technology finds a way of understanding the algorithm and the inner logic of the algorithm in order to find what they want. And find what they want could be different things. It can be volume, which was the case for some. It can be precision. Let's say finding someone that you connect with longer than 24 hours. And uh, so you see and interact by observing it without having a hypothesis, without concluding before you start. You just look and listen for a change, and you follow people over time, and you find only after you've observed for a while, you can see that there are patterns in the behavior. Some of it which are maybe unwanted for a lot of people, and some of it which is freeing and delightful for others. And I think that so what I teach, I call it human observation, and it's simply uh, suspending judgment and looking, collecting information, you could say, collecting data by looking long enough and sort of not empathizing, because that sounds so soft. Uh, um, it's much more cynical than that. Extracting information from people using whatever, in this case, dating apps, to understand how it is part of their world, and what role it plays. Um, so you can do that at scale, right? You can teach observation. And the interesting thing is, when I then talk to some of the, I mean, I talked to a very famous economist that won the Nobel Prize, writing about the market for lemons. And he said, of course, the models are advanced and the mathematical brilliance of it is, of course, there. But at the heart of it is just observation of humans that you then hypothesize from, and then build models from, and then solidify models from. But at the core is this ability to look, um, and suspend judgment, which is key. And a big problem for big parts of the social sciences that have already concluded before they start looking. But that's the key. And it's so hard for them. It's so hard for at least for my students, to not judge, um, and just stay long enough with the phenomenon, not be too involved in the person. I'm not so interested in individuals. I'm interested in groups of people and how they engage with a particular. It can be a technology, or it could be some sort of phenomenon. And then at a certain point, it snaps into place. And in order to do that, you need theory, right? You need theory to engage what you see. But at the heart of it, and I think at the heart of any good scientific effort, including the natural sciences, is this observation ability and paying attention to sort of everything and nothing at the same time. It's sort of a panoptic glaze of attention towards a phenomenon, and that can be done at scale. I think, and I think it can be
So, th-
taught.
so I think Gillian Tett, in her new book about anthropology, argued that, you know, an anthropological perspective helps you to understand others, but at the end of the day, it also helps you to understand yourself and the world that you live in. But there's a point you made in the book which I've, I wanted to wanted to kind of engage you on, which is that this idea that, you need to study the animals on the savannah and not in the zoo, right? And that, you know when you're doing model building, you tend to focus on, you create a zoo, you put the creatures in the zoo, and then you study them in the zoo. But just as with the natural world, there are no animals left on the savannah. The only way that we're going to learn about elephants in the future is going to be by going down to the zoo and studying them. And it seems like that's kind of true with people in a way, because these models have a tendency to not only interpret, but also to shape people, right? There's this feedback loop. Perfect example of this is, Black Scholes, right? So, Black Scholes was meant to kind of describe how options are priced, but of course it didn't really describe how they were really priced until the model was published. And then once the model was published, then of course it actually became pretty good at predicting, prices. And so aren't we all kind of being shaped by the theories that are being developed? I mean, you say Silicon Valley doesn't do a very good job of understanding people, but it's kind of turning people into the the kind of people that you know they thought we were. Isn't there this kind of feedback loop happening?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that can be studied too, I think, in a meaningful way. Maybe I should give an example. Uh, if you The American pickup truck, is a phenomenon. If you're from Denmark, you've never seen it. Not really, at least.
That's a
But
market that Ford could conquer. Ford needs to,
I know.
educate the Danish on the beauty and benefits of a large pickup truck.
Yeah. The roads and the parking lots are not big enough. But you're right. You need to restructure the entire infrastructure. But when you study the American pickup truck, um, I've seen sort of people from coastal American environments going to central part of America with a lot of assumptions and a lot of preconceived notions about the people living there and the people using the trucks. And one of the assumptions is they will never buy an electric version of it, because the burning of stuff is involved, is almost like a political agenda, which turns out to be not true at all. Um, it's also that the truck is about a kind of powerful, engagement with the world, which is true. But when you then, I saw this group of researchers looking at the American truck, and they found that the pickup truck is very connected to community. It's a symbol of being helpful in the community. In many places that, we looked at in America in particular, but also in Brazil and other places, it is connected to being a good person because you can help people move around things, and is quite often connected to the church, which is interesting as well. So the world of the pickup truck is not one necessarily of just about hunting and construction and some sort of like a picture of masculinity that um, y- the researchers might have assumed, but is a very gentle one. Um, and it turns out that helpfulness around a truck is also charging stuff and has nothing to do with the liquid you burn, but has everything to do with the how it sits in the human world in the communities that they live in. Um, and that electrification of these trucks is not just possible, but very attractive for the people using it. So that is putting together the human world around the phenomenon of the American pickup truck and seeing that the assumptions we made and what many people that are maybe in the anthropology or history departments of North America might not have seen had they not gone there, suspended judgment, looked at it, and found the possibilities for innovation and for change in the area. So that's what I mean by suspending judgment. That this this tool of suspending judgment and just looking uh, makes it not just more precise, more a better description, and maybe more surprising description of what's going on with the people you want to serve, but also um, a potential for ideas and innovation and change. So I don't know. That's what I mean by human observation. That just shut up, you know, and try to leave your political opinions, your preconceived notions behind for a little while, um, and see what's going on. You know, uh, and that is for me phenomenology when it's practical and applicable. And I think also things you can change major major things in the world if you do it well and in an organized manner.
So I think you make the claim that cultural inquiry is not a luxury. I mean, it's a necessity. Um, is philosophy a luxury? I mean, you talk about philosophy quite a bit. You're rooted in phenomenology. You talk about Husserl, talk about Heidegger, you talk about my old colleague Hubert Dreyfus. Um, can we expect most people to um, engage with philosophy? And if so, kind of at what level? I mean, I don't expect most people are going to kind of bring Heidegger to the beach and
Uh, that'd
read
be
it with
weird.
their pina coladas and so forth. But there is philosophy as a broader kind of approach to thinking. How can we kind of make philosophy less of a luxury and more of a necessity in life?
Right.
Do you think that I mean, does it have to be in the educational system, or can we incorporate it into how we um, do our HR? One of your favorite topics. How do we make people more kind of philosophical?
Hmm. I mean, if philosophical means being wonky about it, if it means professional philosophy, not the way Hubert Dreyfus did it, because he's a big deal for me, um, but the way it's carried out in most philosophy departments, it's so boring. And I don't think you can convince many people, other than sort of hand waving, that that's helpful. So it, there's a way of um, engaging with philosophy that's perfectly possible to explain to others, see how you use it in a practical way, but it's not the wonky version. Um, and I get that we need that. We need people that are comparing Thomas Aquinas to other contemporaries. And but if you go into a boardroom in a pharmaceutical company and try to start doing that, then their eyes glaze over, and you're not invited back. But if let's take a pharmaceutical firm. If you want to understand uh, how immunotherapy has changed how we look at cancer, let's say, and being told you have cancer, you can study it as a phenomenon, and you can study it as how a disease and a new technology changes human worlds, changes the relationship between the people that are told that they have it, the people that know people that have told that they have it. That can be studied in a sort of by human observation. But if you come and you know try to be snobbish about it, then you lose people, and that's unhelpful for everybody. So, if philosophy is professional philosophy, I don't think it'll work. Should we teach it? Absolutely, right? Because the way to explain philosophy is to understand the tradition and have depth to it. But you also just need to explain that other people doesn't have enough, maybe enough time for it. So I think it
Mhm.
should be integrated everywhere, but not in that way. Um, you know, so
Right. Well, when we have philosophers teaching at the business schools, then we'll know that we've maybe figured it out a little bit.
yeah.
But until then, Christian, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate the conversation. Most recent book called Sensemaking, Power of Humanities in the Age of Algorithm, and you mentioned that you have another book that might be coming out in a year or so. Could you tell us just briefly about that?
Yes, of course. So the next book is going to be called How to Pay Attention, um, and which is kind of cheeky, but it's about observation, and it's a mix of it's again sort of a reaction to what's going on with technology. So of course we are filling the world with cameras and sensors right now, um, and we are doing unassisted learning systems, incredibly technologically sophisticated. But they're human questions, right? The question of seeing and listening is relevant to the question of does a car see, you know? And human worlds is exactly what you could say deep learning is after. Trying to understand how human worlds come together and make sense to people, if they want to get even to sort of cat level, intelligence. So, the best ones will say that. So it's about seeing, and then it's a collection of the best observers that I've seen in, as long as I've lived. It's a collection of uh, people that write about nature. Um, my favorite book in the world, which is called The Peregrine by J. Baker. Um, there are things about the artists visual artists that are helping us understand what seeing is and how we see. So that's artists like Donald Judd and James Turrell and others, and Hubert Dreyfus' favorite, Cézanne, which is sort of the one that gets the closest to painting how humans see, um, and uh, and basically trying to describe through these examples how, how on earth we, when we go down the street, what's that like, and how is that different from, let's say, a sensor or a a camera in a phone. And it turns out it's very different. And so it's this mix of sort of trying to introduce what I find poetic and very skillful observation, and trying to show that this is a reasonable thing to be engaged with if you're interested in technology. So that's the next book, and it's something I've been working on for 20 years, and I can't wait to see what happens.
So I'm wondering, where do you think you learn more about how to see, from looking at paintings or from painting itself? I took a painting class and was never any good at painting, but it completely forever altered how I would see the world. Now, I would probably argue that while I was taking that painting class, I was also taking art history classes, and so there was kind of a feedback loop there. But without actually engaging in the practice, can you know, get better at it, or do you have to kind of practice it while you're learning from others and their practice?
Uh, I suppose you can. For me, it's not been that. For me, it's just looking at the world, and in very simple ways. So that could be, um, how do we relate to animals? How do we see how humans see animals? And it turns out, if you think about it, if you look at groups of animals, you're not counting them. You're not, a flock of lions. You're just seeing a flock of lions. You're not seeing 14 of them or 8 of them. When you see pigeons, you see a reasonable amount of them. You're not counting them. Or when you see dumplings on a plate, you don't see 6 or 7 of them. You see enough or too many. So we have these human categories that we use to experience the world, and that's very different from a camera, where you or a machine that would count it. Uh, when you see a train coming towards you, you don't see a point that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You see a small point, and suddenly it snaps into a big, you know. So we see these holes, or these sort of, in Germany they call it gestalts. Um, And that's how we experience the world, rather than through seeing the same point getting bigger in equal increments, or the amount of dumplings as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We just see that's too many for me, um, and that's very different from you would say a natural science approach. It would be an experiential one. So it's very much about seeing and how that works. Even in the most banal kind of walking down the street, flying with an airplane, taking off with an airplane, looking at animals, and I think that's deeply relevant. And I think many technology people are running into this problem, and are excited about it, because it's a it's it makes it shows how we see the world, even though that might not be the best way if you were sort of theoretical and analytical about it, but it's the way that we see it. So, well, full stop, right? That's what
Well, in addition to learning how to in addition to learning how to see the world more like a human, presumably you also wanted to learn how to see the world like different kind of types of humans, right? So, we
Exactly.
all have these different kind of interpretive schema depending on, where we're coming from. And, it'd be cool, presumably in autonomous driving, if you could say, okay, we're surrounded by a sea of German drivers, we're surrounded by a sea of American drivers. How do you flip that switch and make sure that, the vehicle is driving like a German driver and seeing the world like a German driver and not just
Exactly.
the universal human driver.
Yeah. And that's
Kristen,
very advanced for for
mhm,
driverless vehicle discussion right now. Right now, they just want the car not to run into a ditch. Um, and this is something we know, but the that the engineers would have to trial and error for millions of hours, and it still doesn't work. Why? Well, because we know things that are common sense to us, and that's different. So that's what's exciting about it, I think. And you're right about German and let's say LA style driving is deeply different and has a different mood and different, not different rules, but different styles, you could say. Yeah.
well, I look forward to the book, Christian. Sensemaking, check it out. Thanks so much. We'll talk again soon. Maybe
Thank
next
you
time
so
you're in the
much.
Bay Area.
Thank you.
This is Unsilo, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.